When Cheryl walked into James's family home, she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her. His mother, standing with a cold stare, crossed her arms as Cheryl and James stepped inside. The tension was almost tangible. Cheryl had known his family didn't approve of her, but this was the first time she truly felt their disdain. She was here to announce her engagement, hoping they would at least give their blessing. But as soon as she opened her mouth to introduce herself, James's mother interrupted her with a dismissive glare. "Thank you for wasting our time today," she said coldly. "I understand you're here for a marriage proposal, but we don't approve. Go home." Cheryl's heart sank, but she wouldn't be defeated so easily. She looked at James, who gave her a small, reassuring nod, then turned back to his mother, standing tall despite the hostility in the room. Cheryl introduced herself again, refusing to let James's mother's words shake her. "I'm Cheryl, and I love your son. We're here because we want your blessing." She managed a polite smile, though her heart was racing. James's mother looked her up and down with a smirk. "A girl like you?" she sneered. "My son could do much better." Cheryl felt the sting of her words but tried to remain calm. She'd known James's parents were wealthy and had always held high expectations for their son, but she'd hoped they'd see the sincerity of her feelings. James gently squeezed her hand, silently reassuring her. She was here for him, and no one's approval mattered more than his. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle for his family's acceptance had just begun. They had only scratched the surface of what would turn out to be a very complicated family dynamic. Months earlier, Cheryl had glimpsed this side of James's family unexpectedly. They were at a small cafe, enjoying a peaceful lunch, when a middle-aged woman approached their table. She smiled warmly at James, ignoring Cheryl completely. "James, it's been too long," she said, her tone cheerful yet somehow insincere. Cheryl glanced at James, who suddenly looked tense. The woman then turned her gaze on Cheryl, her expression turning from friendly to almost disdainful. "Oh, are you really spending time with someone like her, James?" she asked with a smirk. Cheryl's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Before she could respond, James's face hardened. "Mom, please don't insult her," he said firmly, his voice laced with anger. His mother's expression soured even further, but she made no effort to apologize. She left without another word, leaving Cheryl with a sinking feeling in her chest. This was a glimpse of what lay ahead. As they walked home that evening, Cheryl could sense James's unease. The silence was heavy, filled with things unsaid. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you stay with me, my mother will make our lives difficult," he admitted. "She's done it before, and she'll do it again." Cheryl looked up at him, searching his eyes for reassurance. Despite the worry etched on his face, she could still see the kindness that had drawn her to him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "We'll face it together." James looked at her with gratitude, though a hint of fear lingered in his gaze. Cheryl felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't let anyone, or anything, stand in the way of their happiness. Yet, as the days passed, she realized that winning over his family would be a far greater challenge than she had anticipated. James had always been reluctant to introduce Cheryl to his parents, which puzzled her. Cheryl's family had welcomed him with open arms, treating him like a son. They even teased her about how lucky she was to find someone so kind-hearted, but every time Cheryl brought up the idea of meeting his family, James would become evasive. One evening, he finally confided in her. "My parents, they're not like yours," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "There are things I'm still coming to terms with." Cheryl didn't press him, sensing the pain behind his words. She wanted him to open up on his own terms, and so she waited. But as the months went by, the weight of his family's disapproval became harder to ignore. Cheryl began to wonder if they would ever truly accept her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper, something James wasn't telling her. Finally, the day came when James arranged for Cheryl to meet his parents formally. Despite her nerves, Cheryl dressed carefully, hoping to make a good impression. When they arrived at his family's grand home, she was struck by its imposing architecture and cold, unwelcoming atmosphere. A large dog barked as they approached, but James calmed it with a gentle touch, smiling at Cheryl as if to reassure her. They entered the house where his mother and father awaited them, standing side by side with stern expressions. The atmosphere was tense, and Cheryl felt the hostility radiating from James's parents. His mother wasted no time, launching into a series of dismissive comments about Cheryl's job, her background, and even her appearance. Cheryl kept her composure, though each word cut deeper than the last. She was here for James, she reminded herself. She wouldn't let them see her hurt. As the tense meeting continued, Cheryl noticed a strained, unspoken tension between James and his parents, especially his mother. There was a bitterness in her voice whenever she addressed Cheryl, as if she blamed her for something beyond her control. Just when Cheryl thought the worst of it was over, her father, who had accompanied her for support, spoke up. "I couldn't help but notice a family resemblance," he said carefully, his gaze shifting between James and another man standing in the background. The man was Mr. Eric, his father's longtime assistant. Cheryl's father continued, "I've studied genetics, and I noticed that neither of James's parents has a widow's peak, yet James does." His words hung in the air, creating a ripple of shock in the room. Cheryl's heart raced as she realized what he was suggesting. Could there be a hidden family secret? James's parents exchanged a panicked look, their faces paling as they realized the implications of Cheryl's father's words. His mother's expression hardened, and she seemed on the verge of denying everything. But after a moment, she looked down, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Yes, Mr. Eric is James's biological father," she admitted, her voice barely audible. James looked at her, stunned. "You lied to me my whole life," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of hurt and betrayal. His mother tried to reach out to him, but he stepped back, rejecting her gesture. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice trembling. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Cheryl's heart ached for him, watching as his entire world crumbled before him. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she knew he needed to process this revelation on his own. As the reality of the situation sank in, James's mother began to cry, pleading for his forgiveness. "We did it to protect you," she said through her tears. "Your father, well, the man who raised you, couldn't have children. When I became pregnant, we agreed to keep the truth hidden for the sake of our family." But James shook his head, unable to comprehend her reasoning. "You lied to me," he repeated, his voice filled with disappointment. Cheryl could see the pain in his eyes, the betrayal cutting deep. Finally, James spoke, his tone cold and distant. "Enough. I'm done with this family." He turned to Cheryl, taking her hand. "We're leaving," he said firmly, guiding her out of the house. As they walked away, Cheryl glanced back, seeing his mother collapsed in tears. But she felt no sympathy. She was determined to stand by James no matter what. After the tumultuous encounter with James's family, Cheryl and James sought comfort in her own home. Her family welcomed James with open arms, offering him the love and support he had missed his whole life. Cheryl's father gave a reassuring speech, encouraging them to focus on their future together. "You don't need their approval to be happy," he said gently. James looked at Cheryl with gratitude, his face softening for the first time in days. They began planning their wedding, determined to create a life together, free from his family's toxic influence. But just when they thought they had left the past behind, James's mother started calling, begging him to return. She even offered her blessing for their marriage, but James refused to answer. He was done with her lies, and nothing she said could change his mind. Despite the challenges, Cheryl and James had a beautiful, intimate wedding surrounded by close friends and family. Cheryl's father gave a heartfelt toast, welcoming James into the family with open arms. It was a moment of peace and joy, a stark contrast to the turmoil of the past few months. As they exchanged vows, Cheryl felt a sense of relief wash over her. They had faced so many obstacles, yet they had come through it all, stronger and more united than ever. After the wedding, they moved into a small house together, excited to start their life as a married couple. They left behind the bitterness of James's family, focusing instead on building a future filled with love and understanding. Cheryl knew there would be challenges ahead, but as long as they faced them together, she was confident they could overcome anything. Years passed, and Cheryl and James welcomed a beautiful daughter into their lives. Cheryl quit her job to focus on raising her, and they settled into a peaceful routine. Occasionally, they would hear rumors about James's family. The company his father once led was struggling, and his mother had fallen on hard times. Mr. Eric had retired, and without his support, the family business was slowly deteriorating. Cheryl felt a pang of sympathy but quickly pushed it aside. They had chosen their path, and she was determined not to let anything disrupt their happiness. Looking at James playing with their daughter, Cheryl felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Despite everything they had been through, they had built a life filled with love, laughter, and trust. In the end, they had found their happiness, not through wealth or approval, but through each other. And that, Cheryl realized, was all they needed.